They say family is supposed to be the last place you get thrown out of. For Margaret Kowalczyk, it was the first. Her son stood in the driveway and told her to leave before the sun went down, and the temperature that night would drop to 25 below zero. She had nowhere to go, one cat carrier, and a coat that wasn't built for Montana winter. What she found 3 miles down a gravel road wasn't just a place to survive the night. It was an old grain silo that no one had opened in 50 years, and inside it was something that would end her son's career before the spring thaw. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maggie stood in the driveway of the house she'd lived in for 11 years and watched her breath turn to fog in the porch light. Dennis was in the doorway, arms crossed, not moving to help her with the second bag. "You can't do this in December," she said. "You should have thought about that before you signed the house back to Dad's estate," Dennis said. "It's not my problem anymore, Mom. Renee and I need the space for the baby." The baby wasn't due for 5 months. Maggie had already offered to take the smaller bedroom, the one that used to be Dennis's office. She'd offered to pay rent from her Social Security check. Renee had said, gently at first, that it wasn't going to work long-term, and then less gently, until it stopped being a conversation and became an announcement. 2 years ago, when Maggie's husband Walter died, the house had passed to her outright. Dennis had convinced her, over a period of months, that it made more sense for the property to go into a trust with his name on it. For tax reasons, he said, for her own protection when she got older. Maggie hadn't finished high school. She trusted numbers on paper less than she trusted her son. She signed what he put in front of her. She found out 3 weeks ago, when she asked to see the deed for an insurance form, that her name wasn't on it anymore. Hadn't been for over a year. "I'll call you a motel," Dennis said now, checking his phone. "There's one off the highway. Maybe $60 a night." "With what money, Dennis?" He didn't answer that. Behind him, Renee appeared in the doorway, holding a mug of tea, watching without saying anything. Next door, Louise Tanner had come out onto her own porch, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, close enough to hear every word and pretending she wasn't listening. "I have $400 until my check comes on the 3rd, Maggie said. "That's it. That's what I have." "Then figure it out," Dennis said. "People figure it out." He went back inside. The door closed. Through the window, Maggie watched him say something to Renee, and Renee laugh, and the porch light went dark like someone had decided the show was over. Maggie stood there for a long moment with Biscuit's carrier in one hand and a suitcase in the other. Louise called something across the yard, an offer maybe a spare room for a night, but Maggie didn't hear all of it. Her ears had started to hurt from a cold. She said something back that she didn't remember later, thanked her, told her she'd figured something out already, which wasn't true. She hadn't figured anything out. She just knew she couldn't stand in that driveway anymore. She walked. Cedar Hollow wasn't a big town, maybe 4,000 people, and once you got past the last streetlight on County Road 9, the dark came down complete and the cold came with it. Her boots weren't rated for this. Neither was her coat. Biscuit made small, unhappy sound from inside the carrier, and Maggie talked to him the way she used to talk to Walter when the silence got too loud, just to hear a voice, even her own. Somewhere around the 2nd mile, past the old rail spur that hadn't carried a train since the 80s, Maggie saw it. A shape against the dark sky, taller than the grain elevators still in use, standing alone in a field that belonged to nobody anymore since the Barrett Grain Co-op folded. She'd heard about it her whole life without ever really looking at it. A concrete tower, maybe 60 feet high, sealed at the base with a door that had rusted at the hinges decades ago. She almost kept walking. It was nothing. It was a grain bin nobody had touched since before Dennis was born. But her feet had stopped hurting for the cold about 10 minutes back, which she knew, distantly, from somewhere was not a good sign. And the door, when she got close enough to touch it, gave a little under her hand. Not open, but not solid either. "I don't know about this one," she said to Biscuit, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Biscuit meowed from inside the carrier, which wasn't an answer, but it wasn't nothing either. Maggie set down her suitcase and pushed with both hands. The door screamed against its hinges, metal on rusted metal, loud enough that she froze and looked around, half expecting headlights, Someone come and tell her she wasn't allowed here either. Nothing. Just the dark field and the wind picking up out of the northwest, the kind of wind that meant the temperature was still dropping. The door gave another 6 inches. That was enough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inside, the wind stopped like someone had cut it off with a knife. That alone almost brought Maggie to her knees with relief. The silo was dark, darker than the field had been, and it smelled like old grain dust and rust and something mineral underneath like a cave. Her phone flashlight showed her a round space, maybe 30 feet across, concrete walls curving up into a darkness she couldn't measure, and a floor covered in a fine gray dust that had probably been wheat or barley 40 years ago. There was a second structure inside, she realized as the light moved. A smaller room built against the interior wall, cinder block, maybe an old equipment shed or foreman's office from when the co-op still ran 3 shifts a day. Its door was intact. Closed, but not locked, because whoever left last hadn't expected anyone to come looking. Maggie stood in the doorway of that little room, biscuits carrier still in her hand, and felt the cold in her feet turn from pain into something closer to numbness, which frightened her more than the pain had. She went inside anyway. There was nowhere else. She set down the carrier, opened it, and Biscuit stepped out into the dust and sniffed the corner of the room like he was deciding whether it met his standards. Maggie almost laughed. It came out instead as something closer to a sob, the first one she'd let herself have since the driveway. "Well," she said, sitting down hard on the concrete floor because her legs had stopped being reliable. "I guess this is us for tonight." Outside, the wind kept climbing. Inside, for the first time in 3 weeks, Maggie Kowalczyk stopped shaking and started very slowly to think. Maggie didn't sleep so much as pass through something adjacent to it. She woke twice in the night, once because her hip had gone numb against the concrete, once because Biscuit had climbed onto her chest and settled there like a space heater with claws. By the time gray light started leaking through gaps around the silo's roof vents, she was cold in a way she'd never been cold before, a cold that had gotten past her coat and her sweater and into the actual bone. She sat up. Her body complained about every part of that decision. The little room looked different in daylight, or what passed for daylight this deep inside a sealed concrete tower. There was a workbench along one wall, warped and gray with age. A single metal shelf, empty except for a coffee can full of rusted bolts. A window, small and grimed over, that let in just enough light to see the shape of things without seeing them clearly. Maggie had $400. She did the math sitting there on the floor because there wasn't much else to do and because doing math felt like doing something. A motel room, even a cheap one off the highway Dennis had mentioned like he was doing her a favor by naming it, ran $55 a night. That was 7 nights. Maybe 8 if she skipped meals. Then what? She was 66 years old. She hadn't held a job since she left the school cafeteria in 2009 to take care of Walter's mother. And after that, it had always seemed like there would be time later to go back to something. And then Walter got sick himself, and then he was gone, and later never came. No employer was going to look twice at her. No landlord was going to rent to a woman with $400 and no income history for 15 years. She knew that without having to test it. She'd watched Louise's own sister go through something similar after her divorce. Watched the doors close one at a time, politely, with regret. We've decided to go another direction. Maggie looked around the little cinder block room and thought about the shelters in Billings, 90 miles away, which might as well have been the moon without a car. She thought about the church on 5th Street that ran a soup kitchen twice a week, which was food but not a bed. She thought about calling Louise, who would take her in for a night, maybe 2, out of neighborly guilt, and then would start finding reasons why it wasn't really working out either, because that was what happened to old women who became problems. She looked at the walls. 2 feet of concrete, she guessed, maybe more. The kind of walls that had been built to hold 100,000 bushels of grain without cracking. Whatever else this place was, it wasn't going anywhere, and nobody was going to knock on its door asking her to leave by Friday. "We could stay," she said out loud, testing the words the way you'd test ice on a pond. Biscuit, curled in the one patch of weak sunlight coming through the grimed window, opened one, eye and didn't seem to object. It was insane. She knew it was insane sitting there thinking it. A 66-year-old woman living in an abandoned grain silo in December was the kind of thing that ended up as a headline, and not a good one. But insane had a certain appeal when the alternative was slowly running out of money in a highway motel until she had nowhere left to go at all. At least here, nobody could raise the rent. Nobody could sell it out from under her while she wasn't looking. She got up, joints stiff, and made herself walk the edges of the main silo floor, the big open cylinder outside her little room. The scale of it surprised her again in daylight. 60 feet up, she guessed, the walls curving toward a domed roof she couldn't see clearly even with her phone light aimed straight up. There were old grain chutes along one wall, rusted solid. A ladder bolted to the concrete that climbed up into the dark and probably led to an access hatch on top, the kind you'd use to check grain levels back when this place actually held grain. The dust on the floor was undisturbed except for her own footprints and biscuits. Nobody had been in here in years, maybe decades. The Barrett Co-op had folded sometime in the 70s, she remembered vaguely, one of a dozen small operations that hadn't survived when the big co-ops out of Billings started buying up all the grain contracts. This tower had just been left standing, forgotten, the way a lot of things in Cedar Hollow got forgotten once they stopped being useful. That thought stuck with her longer than she expected. Forgotten once they stopped being useful. She thought about Dennis in the driveway, telling her to figure it out. She thought about the deed with her name missing from it. She walked back to the little room, where at least the wind couldn't reach her, and sat back down next to Biscuit. "For $100, she said, "and we're not paying a cent of it in rent. Not to your Uncle Dennis. Not to anybody." It wasn't a plan yet. It was closer to a refusal. But by the time the light through the grimed window had shifted from gray to something closer to pale morning gold, Maggie Kowalczyk had stopped asking herself whether she should stay and started asking herself what she'd need to survive the winter if she did. By mid-morning, Maggie had made a list in her head 3 times over. The way she used to make grocery lists before Walter's diagnosis made grocery lists feel pointless. Food, water, something to sleep on besides concrete. A way to see once the light through that grimed window gave out, which she guessed happened around 4 in the afternoon this time of year. She had $400. She was not going to spend it carelessly. The walk back into Cedar Hollow took 40 minutes in daylight, longer than it had felt in the dark and cold the night before, maybe because fear had been doing some of the work for her then. She kept to the shoulder of County Road 9, past the old rail spur, past the Lindqvist place where a dog barked at her from behind a fence, until the first streetlight came into view and the town started again. She went to the hardware store first, not the grocery. Pete Alvarez had run Cedar Hollow Hardware since before Dennis was born, and he didn't ask questions when Maggie came in looking like she'd slept in her coat, because plenty of people in a farming town looked like they'd slept in their coats. She bought 2 battery lanterns and a pack of D batteries. A folding cot, the kind hunters used, on clearance from last season for $18. A 5-gallon water jug. A small propane camp stove with 2 canisters, because she remembered enough from Walter's hunting trips to know an open flame in an enclosed space was how you ended up not waking up, and a propane stove at least had shut off. She bought a box of wooden matches, even though the stove had its own igniter, because Walter always said machines failed and matches didn't. The total came to $61. She paid in cash and didn't meet Pete's eyes too long. Worried he'd ask where all this was headed. Worried more that he wouldn't ask at all. At the grocery store, she was more careful. Rice, dried beans, oats, peanut butter, a case of canned soup, powdered milk. Things that wouldn't spoil, wouldn't need a refrigerator she didn't have. She did the math in the aisle, dividing everything by days, and came out with roughly 3 weeks of food for $19, which felt like something close to a miracle until she remembered 3 weeks was nothing against a Montana winter. She thought about stopping at the bank to check her account balance, then remembered she already knew what it said. She thought about walking past her old house one more time to see if Dennis had already moved his things into her old room, and decided against it. Some things weren't worth the walk. By the time she made it back to the silo, the sky had gone that flat gray it did before snow, and her arms ached from bags. She pushed through the door, which had gotten slightly easier to move now that she'd forced it once already, and the silence and stillness inside felt less frightening this time. Almost familiar. Biscuit met her at the door of the little cinder block room like he'd been waiting. "I brought you something," she told him, and set down a can of tuna she'd bought specifically for him, because a woman down to her last $400 still wasn't going to let her cat eat plain rice. She spent the rest of the afternoon setting up what she was already starting to think of as her room. The cot went against the wall farthest from the door, away from the draft. She could feel even through 2 feet of concrete when the wind hit the silo from the north. She hung one lantern from a nail already in the workbench, tested the other, and set it aside for later. She swept the worst of the dust into a corner with a rag she'd brought from the suitcase, because there was no broom yet and wouldn't be for a while. Around 3 in the afternoon, with the light through the window already starting to die, Maggie sat on the edge of the cot and ate a can of soup cold, straight from the can, because she hadn't figured out the stove yet and didn't want to experiment with fire on her first real night. Biscuit had claimed the foot of the cot. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up again, that low, steady moan it made against the silo's curved walls, a sound she suspected she'd know by heart within a week. She thought about Dennis, not with the raw fury from the driveway, which had cooled into something quieter and harder overnight, but with a kind of clinical distance, the way you'd think about a problem in a puzzle. He'd taken the house. He'd taken the deed. He'd stood in a doorway and told his mother to figure it out, and she was going to figure it out, just not in any way he'd bothered to imagine. She didn't know yet what shape that would take. She only knew, sitting on a cot in a sealed grain silo with a space heater's worth of warmth coming off her cat and a can of soup going cold in her hands, that she wasn't finished. Whatever Dennis thought he'd ended in that driveway, he'd gotten it wrong. The wind kept moaning against the concrete. Maggie pulled her coat tighter, turned off the lantern to save the batteries, and let the dark settle over her like something almost like safety. The cold taught Maggie things in her first week that no one else could have. It taught her, for instance, that concrete holds cold the way it holds heat, stubbornly and for a long time, and that sleeping directly against a concrete wall was the fastest way to lose whatever warmth her body had built up during the day. It taught her that the little cinder block room, small as it was, held her own body heat better than the open silo floor ever would, which was probably the only reason she hadn't frozen that first night. By day 4, she'd started thinking less like a woman in trouble and more like Walter used to think about a broken tractor. Every problem had a cause. Every cause had a fix if you were willing to sit with it long enough. The first real problem was heat. The propane stove worked fine for cooking, but she wasn't willing to run it for warmth, not in a sealed room with one small window and no real ventilation. She'd read enough, back when Walter used to bring hunting magazines home, to know what carbon monoxide did to people in enclosed spaces, and she wasn't going to become a story about that instead. So she went back to insulation, the way her grandmother used to talk about layering, 3 thin blankets doing more work than 1 thick one because of the air trapped between them. Maggie didn't have 3 blankets. She had one from the suitcase and whatever she could scavenge. The old grain chutes gave her an idea. Underneath decades of rust, the co-op had left behind burlap sacks, dozens of them, stiff with age but intact, stacked in a corner of the main silo floor she hadn't fully explored yet. She spent an entire afternoon carrying them into the little room, layering them over the cot, stuffing them along the base of the walls where the draft came through worst. It wasn't pretty. It cut the coal by half, maybe more, and that was worth more to her than pretty. Water was the next fight. The 5-gallon jug lasted 4 days if she was careful, which meant a weekly walk into town just for water, which meant time and energy she didn't want to keep spending. She noticed, on one of the colder mornings, a thin sheet of frost forming along the inside of the silo's dome roof, high up where her lantern light barely reached. Condensation, she realized. The temperature difference between the frozen outside air and whatever warmth rose up from below was pulling moisture out of the air and depositing it up there, same as it did on the inside of a car windshield. She couldn't reach 60 feet up to collect it directly, but she found, on the ladder bolted to the wall, an old rusted collection trough that had probably once funneled grain, angled just enough that water would run if it had somewhere to go. She spent 2 days rigging a system with buckets and a length of gutter pipe she'd found half buried near the old loading dock outside, catching runoff that dripped down from higher in the tower whenever the temperature swung. It wasn't much. A gallon, maybe two on a good day, but it meant fewer trips into town, and she boiled everything before she drank it regardless, because Walter always said if you couldn't see what was in the water, you had to assume the worst was. Light was simpler and also harder because batteries cost money, and money was the one thing she couldn't manufacture out of an old grain silo. She started rationing herself to one lantern for 2 hours after dark, enough to eat by and read by if she'd had anything to read, and then darkness after that because darkness didn't cost anything. Food she managed the way she'd managed a household budget for 40 years, which turned out to be a skill nobody had ever thanked her for, and which was now, unexpectedly, keeping her alive. Rice and beans stretched. Oats stretched further. She learned the co-op's old equipment shed, the one attached to the loading dock, still had a workable door, and the temperature inside stayed close enough to freezing that she could store what little perishable food she had without it spoiling. A walk-in refrigerator nobody had to pay to run. She started walking into town every third day instead of every day, both to save her strength and because she'd noticed Pete at the hardware store watching her a little too closely the third time she came in for batteries. She didn't think he suspected the truth, but she didn't want to test how long that held. By the end of the second week, Maggie had a routine. Wake with the weak gray light through the window. Check the water collection. Eat something warm if she'd planned ahead enough to heat it the night before, cold if she hadn't. Walk into town every third day for what she needed and nothing more. Back before the light failed, because losing the trail in full dark was its own kind of danger she wasn't willing to risk twice. She was cold, always, in a way that had become less like suffering and more like weather, something she simply lived inside of now. But she was alive. She was fed. She hadn't spent more than $40 past that first shopping trip, which meant her $400 was going to last a great deal longer than she'd first feared. And somewhere in the second week, sitting on her cot with biscuit curled against her hip and the burlap sacks holding in what little warmth her body made, Maggie realized she hadn't cried since that first night in the driveway. She wasn't sure when that had stopped. She only knew that the woman who'd stood there watching her son's porch light go dark felt like someone she used to know, not someone she still was. By the third week, Maggie stopped thinking of the silo as somewhere she was stuck and started thinking of it as somewhere she lived. The difference mattered more than it sounds like it should. A place you're stuck in, you don't bother fixing. A place you live in, you do. It started small. She swept the main silo floor properly, all of it, not just the corner near her room, using a broom she'd finally bought on her third trip into town. Underneath the dust, the concrete floor had a faint reddish tint to it, old grain residue baked in over decades, and once it was clean it didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked like a floor. She found more in the old equipment shed than she'd expected on her first pass. A wooden table, 3 legs solid, and one that just needed a shim. 2 chairs, one with a broken cane seat she patched with strips cut from the burlap sacks she wasn't using for insulation. A kerosene lamp, empty but intact, that she cleaned out and eventually filled with fuel bought a pint at a time, so it wouldn't strain her budget in one trip. The Real find came on a Tuesday, walking back from town along a stretch of road she didn't usually take. Cedar Hollow, like every small town, had a certain rhythm to what got thrown away. People cleaned out barns in the fall. They cleared out relatives' houses after funerals. And on trash day, out past the edge of town where the bigger properties sat, people set things at the end of long driveways that were too good to just be garbage and too much trouble to haul to the dump themselves. Maggie found a rocking chair that way. One arm cracked, but reparable. The kind of chair that had probably sat on someone's porch for 30 years before someone's kids decided it didn't match the new place. She found a quilt, stained in one corner but otherwise sound, folded on top of a box marked free and marker that had started to run in the damp. She found, over the following weeks, a chipped ceramic pitcher, a stack of paperback westerns with broken spines, a hand-crank radio somebody's grandfather must have kept in a truck for emergencies, still working once she'd cleaned the contacts. She carried what she could and made 2 and 3 trips for the rest. And slowly, The little cinder block room stopped looking like a place that someone had abandoned in the 70s and started looking like a place someone had chosen. The rocking chair went by the window, angled so the weak daylight fell across it in the afternoon. The table went against the wall opposite the cot, with the two chairs, so there was somewhere to sit that wasn't the bed. She hung the quilt over the burlap sacking on the worst wall, and it did double duty, decoration and insulation both. The pattern faded but still visible, a wedding ring pattern somebody's grandmother had probably pieced by hand. She started keeping the kerosene lamp lit in the evenings instead of the battery lantern, both to save the batteries, and because the light it threw was softer, warmer, made the concrete walls look less like a bunker and more like something with texture and shadow. One evening in early January, sitting in the rocking chair with Biscuit in her lap, and the radio playing something faint and staticky from a station out of Billings, Maggie looked around the room and felt something she hadn't expected to feel again this winter. Not comfort exactly, something closer to ownership. Nobody had given her this. Dennis hadn't given it to her. Renee hadn't given it to her. The trust lawyer hadn't given it to her. She'd built it herself, out of thrown-away things and a stubbornness she hadn't fully known she had until she was tested for it. She started spending time on the main silo floor too, beyond just her little room. She'd swept a wide circle of it clean near the base of the old ladder, and one afternoon, with nothing else to do while a pot of beans simmered, she found herself climbing the first 10 rungs, just to see. The ladder held. She didn't go further, not that day. Her arms weren't what they used to be, but she looked up into the dark curve of the dome 60 feet above her and felt something oddly like curiosity rather than fear. The Barrett Grain Co-op had built this place to last, she realized. Whatever else had gone wrong with it, whatever had made them close their doors sometime in the 70s, the tower itself had never failed. It had just been waiting for somebody to need it again. She thought about Louise sometimes, wondered if she should walk over and let her know she was all right, but she wasn't ready yet to explain where all right actually meant. She thought about Dennis less often than she expected to, and when she did, it was with a kind of distant curiosity, the way you'd think about weather in a city you used to live in. Still happening. No longer your problem. Exactly, except that the deed with her name missing from it was still sitting somewhere in a filing cabinet, still true, still unresolved. By the last week of January, the little room held a rocking chair, a mended table, 2 chairs, a hand-crank radio, a wedding ring quilt, and a woman who had stopped counting the days since she'd cried. Maggie sat there some evenings just looking at what she'd made, this strange, cold, stubborn little home nobody else knew existed, and thought that whatever came next, she wasn't the same person who'd stood in that driveway watching a porch light go dark. She was someone who built things out of what other people threw away. She just never had the occasion to find that out about herself before. The knock came on a Thursday in early February, except it wasn't a knock. It was the groan of the silo's outer door being forced open, and Maggie's whole body went still before her mind caught up to what the sound meant. Someone was coming in. She killed the kerosene lamp with 2 fingers pinched over the wick and sat frozen in the rocking chair, Biscuit tensing against her lap, both of them listening to footsteps cross the dusty floor of the main silo. A flashlight beam swept the dark, catching the edge of her swept path, the base of the ladder, then the door of her little room, closed but not locked because there'd never been anything to lock it against out here. The door pushed open. The beam found her sitting there in the dark like she'd been caught, doing something wrong, which she supposed, technically, she had. "Jesus," a man's voice said, and the flashlight dropped, embarrassed, away from her face. "I didn't. Sorry. I didn't know anyone was in here." He was younger than her by a good 30 years, wearing a county utility jacket with a name patch that read "O. Falk," and he stood in the doorway, looking less like a man who'd caught a trespasser and more like a man who'd walked into somebody's living room by accident, which, Maggie realized, was more or less what had happened. "I'm Owen," he said, when she didn't say anything. "Falk. I do structural checks on the old co-op buildings for the county every couple years, make sure nothing's about to come down on somebody's cattle." He looked past her at the table, the chairs, the quilt on the wall. "I did not expect this." Maggie found her voice eventually. "I can explain. You don't have to explain anything to me, ma'am. This isn't a police thing. He stepped back half a pace, giving her room, which she appreciated more than she could have said. "How long you been out here?" "Since December," Maggie said. "The 11th. Owen was quiet a moment, doing the math on that, on what December meant for temperature in this part of Montana, on what it meant that she was sitting in front of him alive and reasonably well 8 weeks later. "That's a hell of a thing," he said finally. "Most people wouldn't have made it a week." She told him because there didn't seem to be a version of this conversation where lying made sense. She told him about Dennis, about the trust, about the deed with her name gone from it, about the driveway and the porch light going dark. Owen listened without interrupting, crouched now against the doorframe like he wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. "I'm supposed to file a report on this building's condition," he said when she finished. "Whether it's fit to stand, whether it's a hazard to anybody using the field around it." Maggie's stomach dropped. "And if you file it, they'll know I'm here." "I didn't say that's what I was going to do." He looked around the room again, at the care in it, the mended chair, the swept floor. "My aunt went through something like this. Not this exactly, but a divorce that stripped her down to nothing at 60. Took her 4 years to get back on her feet, and that was with a sister who let her sleep on a couch the whole time." He shook his head slightly. "This building's sound. Structurally, I mean. Whoever poured this concrete in the 50s knew what they were doing. I can write that down and leave it there." "Why would you do that for me?" "Because you're not hurting anybody, and you built something out of a place that was just sitting here rotting." He straightened up. "You need anything? Real anything, not stubborn anything." She thought about saying no on reflex, the way she'd said no to Louise's half-heard offer back in December, and then thought better of it. A better way to keep water from freezing overnight would help. Owen came back 3 days later with a case of insulated jugs, and, more useful than that, became someone Maggie could call if the wind got bad enough to worry about the roof vents. He left his number on a card tucked into the doorframe, and told her to use it if she needed to. It was 2 weeks after that, in the middle of finally getting up the nerve to climb higher on the old ladder, that Maggie found the thing that changed everything. She'd been curious about a metal hatch set into the wall about halfway up, past where the grain chutes fed in, a panel that didn't match the rest of the tower's construction, newer, added sometime after the original build. She'd noticed it weeks earlier and put it out of her mind as nothing, an access panel for old wiring maybe. But with Owen's flashlight, a real one, borrowed and not yet returned, she could finally see it properly. It wasn't a wiring panel. It was a strong box, bolted into a recessed space in the wall, the kind of thing you'd install if you wanted something kept safe from fire and flood both, the kind of thing a grain co-op treasurer might have installed back when co-ops still handled real cash for grain settlements before everything went electronic. The lock was old, mechanical, rusted at the edges but not seized. Maggie sat on the ladder rung, 60 feet of empty air below her feet and a small cold metal box in front of her, and felt something she hadn't felt since the driveway in December. Curiosity sharp enough to override the cold entirely. It took Maggie 11 days to get the strongbox open. She wasn't proud of how long it took, sitting on that ladder rung with her flashlight propped in her teeth, trying combination after combination she'd copied out of an old library book Owen had brought her on a whim. A paperback on antique locks and safes that some collector in Billings had probably donated decades ago. Common factory defaults from the 50s, sequences co-op managers might have used because they were the easiest to remember. Birth years, anniversaries, sequential numbers. On the 11th day, sitting with her fingers half numb from the cold metal dial, the lock gave with a small mechanical click that felt, in that moment, louder than anything she'd heard all winter. Inside were folders, not cash, which disappointed her for about 4 seconds before she started reading and understood that what she'd found was worth considerably more than whatever cash might have once been in there. The Barrett Grain Co-op hadn't just folded in the 70s. It had been looted slowly and carefully by its own management in the years before it closed. The folders held ledgers, correspondence, records of grain settlements paid out to member farmers at rates far below market value, with the difference funneled into a private account held by the co-op's treasurer at the time, a man named Harold Doss. Maggie sat with that name for a long moment before it clicked into place. Ray Doss, the current county commissioner, The man who'd been on the council for almost 20 years and who Cedar Hollow generally regarded as a pillar of the community. The man whose father, it turned out, had quietly stolen from half the farmers in the county before the co-op collapsed and the records disappeared, presumed lost, into a strongbox nobody remembered existed. That alone would have been a story. But 3 folders down, Maggie found something that mattered to her far more directly. A land transaction, dated 2009, cross-referenced against a name she knew as well as her own. The old Whitfield parcel, 40 acres adjoining the Kowalczyk property, had been quietly folded into the Barrett estate holdings during a period when Ray Doss's office was overseeing the disposition of unclaimed co-op assets. And handling the paperwork on the county's side, listed as legal counsel, was a name Maggie recognized from somewhere closer to home. Dennis had used the same attorney, years later, to draw up the trust that took her house. It took Maggie another week of careful reading, cross-checking dates against the paperback library books Owen kept bringing her to understand the full shape of it. The attorney, a man named Grady Pierce, had built a small, quiet practice over 2 decades helping people like Ray Doss and eventually people like Dennis move assets around in ways that stayed just barely inside the law or slipped just barely outside it, depending on who was looking and how closely. Dennis's trust, the one that had stripped Maggie's name off her own house, used almost the exact same legal structure Pierce had used for the co-op land transfer 15 years earlier. Same boilerplate, same loophole. Maggie photographed every page with Owen's borrowed phone, since her own was too old to hold a decent picture, then transferred the images to a library computer in town, saving copies in 2 separate email accounts she set up for exactly that purpose. She spent hours in the Cedar Hollow Library after that, reading up on elder financial abuse statutes, on how trusts could be challenged if it could be shown the person signing had been misled about what they were signing. She wrote, by hand first, and then typed on a library computer, a careful account of what Dennis had told her when he asked her to sign the trust. For tax reasons. For her protection. Words that, read against what she now knew about how Pierce structured these things, looked less like a son helping his mother and more like a son emptying her hands while telling her it was a gift. She didn't rush. That was the hardest part, sitting on what she'd found through the back half of February while the temperature outside stayed brutal and her own patience wanted nothing more than a march into town and put every folder on Dennis's kitchen table. Instead, she waited, and she built her case the way she'd built everything else that winter, out of whatever materials she had at hand, and a stubbornness nobody had ever had reason to notice in her before. She contacted the state attorney general's office first, the division that handled financial exploitation of the elderly, sending copies of the trust documents alongside her written account of what Dennis had told her when he asked her to sign. She sent a second package to a probate attorney in Billings, a woman named Priya Anand whose name she'd found through the library's legal aid directory, along with a note asking, carefully, hypothetically, what recourse existed for a trust signed under misleading circumstances. She sent nothing yet about Ray Doss or his father. That was a separate fire, and Maggie had learned enough that winter about patience to know you didn't light 2 at once if you wanted either of them to burn clean. By the first week of March, with the worst of the cold finally starting to loosen its grip on Cedar Hollow, Maggie Kowalczyk sat in her rocking chair with biscuit in her lap, and 3 manila envelopes sealed and ready on the mended table beside her, and felt, for the first time since a porch light went dark in December, something that felt almost exactly like power. Priya Anand called on a Tuesday in late March, and Maggie took the call standing outside the silo door, because that was the only spot where her old phone reliably held signal. "Mrs. Kowalczyk, I've read through everything you sent me twice now," Priya said. "I want to be direct with you. What you've described, and what these documents support, is one of the clearer cases of elder financial exploitation I've seen come through this office. The trust your son had you sign transferred sole ownership of your home without adequate disclosure of what you were giving up. Combined with your written account of what he told you at the time, we have grounds to challenge it. What does that mean practically? It means we filed to void the trust and restore the property to your name. It means, depending on how the court views the pattern here, Dennis may also face consequences beyond losing the house. Misappropriation of an elderly parent's assets carries criminal exposure in this state, not just civil. Maggie stood in the cold with the phone against her ear and found she didn't feel triumphant so much as tired. The particular tiredness of finally setting down something heavy she'd been carrying without quite realizing how much it weighed. The case moved faster than she expected, partly because Priya was thorough and partly because the second package Maggie had sent, the one about Ray Doss's father and the looted co-op funds, had landed on a desk at the state auditor's office and detonated into something considerably larger than Maggie had anticipated. A commissioner with 2 decades of community standing, sitting on a father's old theft from half the farmers in the county, made for the kind of story the Billings paper couldn't resist. Doss resigned before the month was out, citing family health reasons that fooled nobody. Grady Pierce's law practice came under review not long after, once investigators started pulling the thread on how many of his other trust arrangements followed the same quiet pattern. Dennis's case moved separately, but not slowly. Faced with Maggie's documented account, the trust paperwork itself, and a mother willing to testify to exactly what he'd told her the day she signed it, his own attorney advised him to settle rather than fight. The trust was voided in April. The house returned to Maggie's name in full. Dennis avoided criminal charges only by agreeing to a civil settlement that included a formal accounting of the estate and a payment to Maggie that, combined with the house's return, left her in a position she hadn't been in since Walter died. She didn't move back into the house right away. That surprised people when word got around Cedar Hollow the way word does in a town of 4,000. Louise asked her about it over coffee one afternoon in May, the two of them sitting on Louise's porch instead of Maggie's, and Maggie found she didn't have a tidy answer, only a true one. "I don't know if it's my house anymore," she said. "Not the way it used to be. I think I need somewhere that's just mine, built by my own hands, before I go back to living somewhere that was built around somebody else's decisions." She sold the house that fall, quietly, to a young family from Billings looking to relocate, and used part of the money to do something Cedar Hollow hadn't expected either. She bought the old Barrett grain co-op property outright from the county, all 4 acres of it, silo included, for $11,000 that felt, to her, like the fairest trade she'd ever made. She hired a contractor out of Billings to do what she couldn't do herself: real insulation, proper wiring, a wood stove with a code-compliant chimney, plumbing routed up from a well she had drilled that spring. She kept the rocking chair. She kept the mended table and the wedding ring quilt. Moved now to a real bedroom with real walls, though she left the little cinder block room exactly as it had been that first winter, untouched, a kind of shrine to the version of herself who'd built a home out of burlap sacks and stubbornness. By the following winter, the Barrett silo had electricity, heat, and a garden Maggie had started in the field outside once the ground thawed. Owen still came by sometimes, no longer for county business, just because he'd become something like family in a way Dennis, despite the blood between them, no longer was. Maggie gave one interview to the same Billings paper that had covered Doss's resignation and told most of the story, though she left out some of the harder details, the exact numbers, the specifics of the vault, some things that felt like hers alone to keep. The article ran with the headline, "Woman Kicked Out at 25 Below Builds New Life in Abandoned Silo," and within a week it had been picked up by 3 other papers and shared thousands of times online. She started getting letters, actual letters, forwarded through the paper's office, from women who'd been pushed out of their own homes by children or husbands who decided they were no longer useful. She answered as many as she had time for, always with some version of the same thing. You are not finished just because someone decided you were. Look for what's still standing. Build there. One evening in December, exactly a year after Dennis had stood in a doorway and told her to figure it out, Maggie sat in her rocking chair with biscuit in her lap, a fire going in the wood stove, and looked around the silo that was now, in every way that mattered, entirely hers. She thought about the cold that had nearly taken her that first night, and thought that some kinds of cold were worth surviving if what waited on the other side was a life nobody could take from her again. If Maggie's story moved you, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We share powerful stories every week about people who turned their darkest moments into their greatest victories. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.